A little over a year ago, most of us here knew that the world had changed and had changed forever. Even if back then we didn't quite understand how. So it's not just about geopolitics, but a shift in the global balance of power, not just about instability in Europe and the potential for widening conflict. It's not just about global economies and rebalancing of energy supply. It's not just about an ideological struggle between authoritarianism and liberal democracy. It's not even just about the ghastly horror unfolding in front of our eyes in Ukraine. Because in addition to all this, our societies have changed. Even if we don't really notice it from day to day, we're all having to confront the reality of a brutally violent interstate war between advanced nations that many in our Western populations had considered to be a thing of the past. This realization is changing fundamentally how we think about the world, and perhaps makes us, who are lucky enough to live in democracies, take our freedom less for granted than we did, and even perhaps worth fighting for. So, for example, in the United Kingdom, the constant siren calls for unilateral nuclear disarmament have been silenced. Even those on the left of British politics have been frightened by frequent calls in the Russian media for Britain's nuclear annihilation, and France's too. And it's not just in Europe that nations today are rearming and taking the possibility of war seriously, really for the first time since 1989. So this is the first of a series of events we've planned as the Russia-Ukraine war looks to be with us for some time yet. On 21st of March, we're planning a panel of experts to discuss the state of the Russian internal opposition to Vladimir Putin. And on 18th April, we will run one of our periodic military strategic analyses of the war and take a look forward to what factors might shape its future. But tonight, I'm delighted to introduce our panel. We've got three speakers, each of whom will take a different view of the political, economic, and social aspects of the war, how it's developed over the past year, and potentially its future impact. Our first speaker, Stefan Romanev, have I got that right? Near enough, OAM, a prominent member of Melbourne and Australia's Ukraine diaspora, the first vice president of the Ukrainian World Congress and co-chair of the Australian Federation of Ukrainian Organizations. Stefan will explore the first year of the war from the Ukrainian perspective. Stefan.
Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity to be back here again. Before I start, I'd like to just acknowledge that Yanama Politejko is a member of our executive, the Australian Federation of Ukrainian Organizations. And just to let you know how long this has all been going, we've got His Excellency Bob Tyson here somewhere. Bob was the ambassador in Moscow responsible for Ukraine many, many moons ago. And we were fighting the same thing then, and we continue to fight the same thing now. And that is fighting for sovereignty, fighting for territorial integrity, and fighting for the fact that Ukraine is an independent country. 365 days. I thought I'd start with the simple thing, which is not so simple, but tells the story. In front of you, you have a sheet produced by the Ombudsman in Ukraine. So 365 days, we've had 459 children killed, 914 injured, 341 missing, 14,450 children that have been taken forcibly to Russia. We have 11,000 people wounded. We have 7,000 people killed. We have 3,126 destroyed educational institutions, 786 destroyed kindergartens, 1,113 destroyed healthcare facilities, 205 destroyed religious buildings, 884 cultural objects, 143,800 destroyed houses. We have railway stations, 113. We have 1.4 million people without access to water. We have 14 million people who became homeless. We have 5.9 million citizens who became international displaced persons. We have 12.5 million people became refugees. Of those, there are about 7,000 in Australia. What I'm trying to the picture I'm trying to paint is this war is real. It has real impact. And over those 365 days, the Ukrainian army, the Ukrainian people have stood very, very strong. The Ukrainian people have fought off this Russian aggression. Putin, who thought that flowers would be thrown from buildings in Kyiv, those flowers have wilted. What's grown are forests of people, of armies who are defending Ukraine. So when you look at that 365 days, and I've been to Ukraine probably 4 or 5 times in that period, to see the change in attitude of people. Ukraine has become far more resilient. Ukraine has become very, very determined, and we will win. We will win because the world has changed. If you go back 365 days, the world was a different place. We had different partnerships. We now have partnerships that are very, very strong. We have President Biden going to Ukraine together with a range of others. We've had Prime Minister Albanese go. Who would have thought Albanese was the first Prime Minister to go to Ukraine in this sort of situation? Ukraine wasn't important, but Ukraine's become very, very important now because it's the defender of values. It's the defender of the world that we want. And when I look at the children, we all in this room either have children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren. What do we want for our children? You don't want to think anything more than a normal life, a normal education. So why is Ukraine not allowed to have that? Why aren't Ukrainian parents allowed to have that? So over 365 days, the world has changed, attitudes have changed, but I think we've all become more and more resilient. It's a bit like COVID. When we had COVID, we could reflect. We had time to stop. The 365 days, I think the normal guy in the street has now stopped to think about, and I'm not just talking about Australia, I'm talking about internationally. What sort of a world do I want? Do I want a bully? Do I want a tyrant? Do I want somebody who has abused every international convention and is not being held accountable by the courts as yet because he hasn't been dragged into the courts? So what does this all mean for us? I think what it means is that collectively, we want to have a better world. Collectively, we want to be able to work together to defeat evil. Collectively, the Ukraine has shown the way. Now, I did a thing recently on optimism, a podcast. Somebody asked me, well, how can you be optimistic? And I put it into 3 baskets. You know, there's short term. You know, in life, there's short term. And the short term here is no pain, no gain. There's going to have to be fighting. There's going to have to be death and so on. Medium, there's going to be rebuild. Ukraine will win. There'll be rebuild. And long term, there'll be very, very few people that don't want to be associated with Ukraine, whether it be economically, whether it be socially, because Ukraine and its people have shown that we can defend what has to be defended. So if we look at it from an Australian perspective, the Australian Federation of Ukrainian Organisations over the last 365 days, you know, when I look back to this day, 12 months ago, and Yanama will know, we called together what we call a war. It was a war cabinet. We brought together the Australian Federation of Ukrainian Organisations. What are we going to do? We had a meeting with a call from the then Prime Minister Morrison, who said, come to Canberra, what are we going to do? We discussed how we would bring people out of a danger zone. And now we've got 7,000 Ukrainians who have settled here as displaced people. What did that demand? That demanded the government had to change its policy very, very quickly as to how it was going to allow people into the country. We as a community, we had to refocus. Nobody, you know, we were thinking about having issues such as having concerts, and today, where are we? We're at a completely different space. To finish off, a lot of people saying, how's this going to end and what should Ukraine do? You know, in the last couple of days, we've had a lot of people say, well, you know what, there's got to be a compromise. I don't speak on behalf of Ukraine, but I can certainly express the sentiment. There will be no compromise in terms of sovereignty. There will be no compromise in terms of territorial integrity. Ukraine will continue to fight until it gets what belongs to it. So if you look at why, if you look at yesterday's Q&A, 73% of those, and you know, you can look at those sorts of situations any way you like, but 73% said there should be no compromise. Why shouldn't there be no compromise? And this is I did a thing for Sky last week about the Chinese. If the Chinese want to have a resolution to this, why are you talking to the tyrant? Why aren't you talking to President Zelensky when Zelensky's asked you for a conversation? And any involvement now of China, because Russia is running out of steam, any involvement will then obviously see things escalate. We're confident we will win. And to say at the end, to say thank you to Australia, to say thank you to the Australian government, thank you to the Australian media. What we have to do now is our discussions in Canberra next week will be this. What do we do strategically over the next 12 months to support Ukraine? At the moment, we've had this situation where it's been sporadic. We've had to do this, we've had to do that. Now we have to sit and think collectively, what are we going to do over the next 12 months to ensure we don't get Ukraine fatigue? Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. I'm going to abuse my privilege of running the panel by asking each of you a question after your talk, but I'll ask the general audience to hold their questions till the end. Now, you highlighted one of what for me is probably the key characteristic of this war, which is the resolve, courage, and strength of will of the Ukrainian people. Overwhelmingly determined not to surrender, not to compromise. What sense do you have of the views of the population of occupied Ukraine, Donbass and Crimea? Are they as determined to be as free of Russia as the rest of Ukraine, or has their nationalism in some way been confused by some 9 years of Russian occupation now?
In a nutshell, I think if you look at the number of people who have escaped that part of the world, when I say escape, have left there to settle in Kiev or in other parts of Ukraine, that tells you part of the equation. When Putin was giving out passports, everybody wasn't jumping for passports. And I think ultimately you have a situation where I've been to Eastern Ukraine, you know, and in 2010, I started a program called, it was called Pochid na Skid. It was a march on the East, because I believe that from the diaspora point of view, there's no point trying to convince people in the West they should be patriotic. You go to the Eastern Ukraine and they are because they've had to fight for everything that's Ukrainian. And the Russian propaganda machine obviously works. And let me just give you one example about how the Russian propaganda machine works. Obviously, they're trying to convince people that, you know, this life's going to be better. Ask Crimea, go to Crimea. Everybody said, oh, it's going to be fantastic. Well, people are now saying, mate, we haven't got water, we haven't got this. You promised us the world, we've got nothing. The tennis was here. You know, the campaign we ran about the flag and no Russian flags, etc. The International Olympic Committee started the conversation about allowing Russia to be part of the Olympics in Paris. One of the photos that was held up to convince some of the people, if you remember when the tennis was on here in Melbourne, a Ukrainian girl and a Russian girl were playing, and there was those three guys holding a Russian flag, and that's how started the whole thing about the flags and that. They held this up to say, look, people can live together. What about the background, about all the nonsense that went on here, how we banned everything? So the propaganda machine in Russia works very, very, very strong. But I don't think, that's my opinion, it's not the opinion of, you know, somebody in Ukraine, but speaking to people in Eastern Ukraine, Luhansk, Donetsk, those sorts of places, the general sentiment is, we just want to live, we want peace. We want peace, but we don't want peace at any cost.
So thank you. Our second speaker is Peter Kuzmin. He is a Russian-Australian anti-war activist, one of the founders of a grassroots pro-democracy movement, the Svoboda Alliance in Australia and New Zealand, that sprang up organically following the protests after Russia in 2021, when Alexei Navalny returned back to Russia and was arrested. Now, I've asked Peter to do an extremely difficult job as an anti-war, anti-Putin activist to talk about developments in Russia.
First of all, I want to thank Richard and Alastair for hosting this panel. And also I want to thank Stefan, especially for allowing me to share this platform. My home country is committing unthinkable atrocities in Ukraine right now, and my heart is breaking about what is happening, what my compatriots are doing in Ukraine. I do hope for the end of this war, but it has to be a victory for Ukraine. I believe that for lasting peace in Europe, Ukraine has to regain all of its territory, including Crimea. And Russia, in order to re-enter the community of democratic, civilized countries, global community, would have to pay reparations. We will have to help rebuild Ukraine. So as an Australian, as a Russian Australian, I'm very deeply committed to a vision of a democratic, progressive, civilized Russia. And I feel very responsible for doing whatever I can to actually help influence the course of this war. I have no illusions about our ability to stop the war, my ability to stop the war, but at least I can impact the perceptions. And I do feel really strongly that Russians who are in a democratic country, we need to support Ukraine. We need to show support for the Ukrainian people. And that's what we've been doing here in Australia. But today I want to emphasize a single message about the Russian society, which might not fit the mainstream narrative about the war. So the invasion of Ukraine started as Putin's war, and he has the ultimate responsibility for this war. Unfortunately, there is a risk of this war becoming Russia's war, and Russian propaganda, Putin's propaganda, has been doing whatever it can long before the start of the invasion to convince the Russian people that there is overwhelming support for the war. Based on all of my observations of what's happening, I don't believe it's true. We cannot take seriously the polls which are conducted right now. The Kremlin propaganda has weaponized sociology a long time ago. The polls have been used to create this image of overwhelming support for Putin, for his policies, for his decisions, and it's used to control the population. Of course, it's not just Putin who is responsible for the war. Everybody who is involved in the war machine, who is all the propagandists, they bear the responsibility for all the war crimes that are currently being committed in Ukraine. But there's definitely no overwhelming support for this war. And there are a few there's quite a bit of circumstantial evidence for that being the case. So the start of the war was a shock for the whole society, Russian society, and tens of thousands of people did come out into the streets of Moscow, St. Petersburg, other cities to protest against the war. The problem is that Putin's machine of repression is really, really powerful. So more than 20,000 people have been detained for their anti-war protests, and any form of dissent, even the most the simplest, most peaceful form of dissent has been criminalized. People have been detained for coming out with a blank sheet of paper into the street and picketing with a blank sheet of paper with a copy of Leo Tolstoy's War and Peace. The word war itself was prohibited and outlawed. You cannot call this, it's a special military operation, it's not a war. So anybody who has even used the word war is at the risk of being punished. New laws, repressive laws have been passed very quickly as soon as it became obvious that the war is not going according to Putin's plan, and there was a need to actually make it impossible for people to protest against this war. So all of the independent, remaining independent media outlets have been banned, were banned almost immediately. TV channel Dost, Novaya Gazeta newspaper, Echo of Moscow radio station, kind of central station for dissident voices. So everybody has been forced into silence or exile. And all forms of legal opposition has effectively been outlawed. Ilya Yashin, one of the leaders of the opposition movement in Russia, in Moscow, he had a very popular YouTube channel with millions of views where he was attacking Putin's regime for many years. He was arrested for his video about the atrocities committed in Bucha. He was charged with spreading fakes about the Russian army. He has been sentenced to more than to 8 or 9 years in prison, and he's been in prison all this time. So if there is an overwhelming support for the war, why is there such a need for such laws? Why is there a need to shut everybody up? Anyone who attempts to present a perspective which is different from the mainstream one. Another piece of evidence is Putin's struggle to recruit for his army. So when the war when it became evident that the 150,000 strong force that was accumulated at the borders wasn't sufficient for the successful completion of the war, Putin started actively recruiting for volunteer recruits for the armed forces, and huge contracts by Russian standards were being offered to these recruits. A person who would sign this contract would be able to earn in a month more than a person would be able to get in a whole year. If you look at the payments that people were promised for being injured in the war or being killed, that dwarfs any sort of earnings people, an ordinary person in the provincial city could actually earn in a lifetime, really. So Putin was trying to buy the support for the war, but he was struggling. This effort failed. So within 6 months, it became clear that it wasn't enough. People weren't signing up willingly enough. So then criminals were being recruited in Russian prisons, people without hardly any rights. So just to wrap up, I want to emphasize that people in Russia live under a wartime dictatorship. There's a massive machine of repression. Russia has a police force which is almost 1 million people. The total number of staff in law enforcement agencies is over 4 million people. So Putin's dictatorship is committing a lot more resources to control its own population compared to the amount of forces he sends to Ukraine. There's definitely fear on his part that the population will rise up, but it's I think it's important to really keep a perspective on what's realistic. Unfortunately, if we are all outraged about the war, and we want Russian people to rise up, but we need to be realistic what we're expecting. It's difficult to resist this war machine, but there is an important fight going on for the minds of the Russian people, and I think, as well as supporting Ukraine with by military means, humanitarian aid, it is also important not to alienate the Russian people and actually try and find ways of activating their agency, showing to the Russian people that the Western society is not against all the Russians. It is against the Russian regime, and we need to really find ways of split up the support, not push the Russian people in the arms of Putin's dictatorship, but really find ways of breaking up this monolith that Putin and his propaganda machine is trying to create.
Yes, thank you. That's a really compelling argument. Thank you, Peter. It's a really compelling argument that not all Russians obviously support Putin's war or indeed support Putin's regime. But what surprised me surveying Russian mainstream and social media is that it does appear to be a widespread acceptance of the idea of Russian exceptionalism, of the idea of Russian imperialism, that Russia somehow seems to have a right to rule over its neighbors. Is this impression that I've got actually right? And if so, is there ever going to be a future for a peaceful Europe?
My conviction is that this is a myth that has been created over a long period of time. Of course, Russia has this legacy of imperial past, and there is no denying that Russia was an empire, and lots of people, especially those who have really nothing in their everyday life, they're trying to compensate for lack of rights, lack of basic necessities with a sense of purpose, greater purpose. So one of the strategies of Putin's regime has been to really keep the vast majority of the population is in extreme poverty. And it's easier to control a poor population when you have all the mainstream media controlled, but also social media is controlled. It's heavily infiltrated by trolls, and that has been happening for at least 15 years, a lot more than people in the West became aware of this problem with social media manipulation. So what I see happening is that, of course, on TV channels, Russian propagandists will be talking about exceptionalism, that Russia has its own path, because this is the nature of Putin regime. Its sole purpose is to preserve the power of Putin. Russian state in its current form does not exist without Putin. So yes, propaganda will keep on selling a dream of Russian exceptionalism to the ordinary people. And at the same time, you have in social media basically very skilled campaigns trying to manipulate the attention. And I can see quite a lot of tweets, social media posts. If you dig in deeper, you see that these are planted, and they are playing into this image of Russians being bloodthirsty imperialists. The reality is, I think, without Putin in power and without this propaganda machine, Russians will refocus internally. There are so many problems within Russia itself, within the Russian society, and we do have the democratic opposition in Russia is really united about foreign policy and about the future of Russia. Alexei Navalny and others believe in federalization. They believe in parliamentary democracy rather than presidential democracy that we currently have, presidential republic. So there's definitely going to be, once the Putin's regime is out, there's definitely going to be a decentralization of power. And with a massive country like that, I don't think Russia would have any resources, any attention, any time to actually focus on external aggression.
Thank you. Thank you. Now, for our third speaker, we're extremely lucky at short notice to have Senator David Ban come to join us. Liberal Senator for Victoria, elected in 2019, Deputy Chair for the Subcommittee on Foreign Affairs and Trade of the Joint Standing Committee on Foreign Affairs, Defence and Trade. He's been a long-standing supporter of this institute, and he's a member of several parliamentary friendship groups, co-chairing the groups for Ukraine, Spain, Mexico, Thailand, and the Pacific Islands. Is that right? Have I missed
and a couple of others, yeah.
So we've asked Senator Ban to talk to us this evening, really about generally about the Western response, but also specifically about Australia. David.
Thank you so much, Richard and Alistair, for inviting me, and thank you all very much for coming. I'm going to start a little bit closer to Ukraine and work my way back towards Australia, if that's okay. Last year in August, I travelled to Ukraine. I met with many ministers while I was there, MPs, and I was lucky enough to go forward into Donbass, into the area of operations, to see our Bushmasters that we donated to Ukraine, seeing them in operation, getting to learn the lessons of how they're using them on the ground. And I'll come back to this because it's the important lesson that's being missed here in Australia. I think it's fair to say that Russia has already lost this war in many ways. There's still a war to be fought, don't get me wrong. And we're doing all we can to ensure that it does win. But if you look at his original designs, he thought he'd decapitate the government, take over Kiev, and rule the nation as part of Russia. That was clearly never going to happen, whether you take into account any of the military misoperations, I think it's safe to say. And I don't know whether there's a spare spot on that military strategy day you're doing on this, Richard, but I could talk as much about that as I can about the international relations side of it. So how that came about was two things, and I saw this firsthand when I was in Ukraine. First thing was the resilience and the resistance of the Ukrainian people. I cannot tell you how overwhelming the sense of unitedness, of strength and of resilience that you get a sense of when you are in Ukraine. Whether that's in Kiev, every barista, taxi driver, everyone I spoke to, would talk about, I'm just waiting to be called up. I'm waiting for my mobilization. I cannot wait to go and fight this fight. Everyone there is up for this fight. Everyone there is willing to go down to the last person and fight for Ukraine. Forgive my voice, I'm just getting over COVID second time. No, you're safe. I was with you on Friday night. So it was overwhelming, this sense of united purpose. And as a scholar of military studies, that's one thing that you will always look for in a fighting force. How united is it? How willing is it to go and fight? And we've seen, and I'm sure Peter would talk to this as well, the Russian forces, whether it be the prisoners, the Mobics, even their normal forces, aren't really up for this fight. Other than Prigozhin's, criminals, there's no one really up for this fight. And even there, you're putting prisoners into the battle just as fodder for the meat grinder. So with that resilience of purpose and strength of purpose, combined with how, and I won't just say the West, because there is now a coalition, about 50 countries that are supporting Ukraine with aid, both financial, humanitarian, and military aid. Now that's a united purpose across the globe that is hard to think of when we've last seen that, other than most likely in the last World War and the two World Wars. I don't think we've seen such a united force since then, and that's really important for a number of reasons. Obviously the US is leading this. They've put in $30 billion worth of military aid. The rest of the world, the rest of the coalition has put in about the same amount. Australia's made a contribution, but I'll come back to that. But the real rationale behind this is, yes, we need to fight for Ukraine because they deserve their sovereignty and their territorial integrity. No one's disputing that for 1 minute outside of Russia anyway. But the real purpose for getting behind this is being able to say to all authoritarian regimes, no, we're not having this. You cannot take over another country by force. And that's really important for us here in Australia for reasons I assume are not lost on this audience. But for the audience at home, we are facing a security challenge here in our region that is beyond anything that we've seen probably since the Second World War. And I was at Avalon Air Show today, the Air Force's trade show, and I met with many chiefs of services and of defence forces from other countries. There's about 50 countries there, and there was 23 service chiefs. And I didn't get to speak to all of them, but quite a few, and a few very significant ones. And when I told them that I'd been to Ukraine, they all were going, now that's something that's worth talking about. And they wanted to know more, they wanted to learn more. But why? Because they want to reinforce back to their home countries the importance of this fight for what it says to other authoritarian regimes, particularly here in the Indo-Pacific. That 50 countries can come together and provide $60 billion worth of military aid, that those countries can come together and I've forgotten how many rounds of sanctions that are now pretty much universal, and the damage that that's slowly doing to the Russian economy. And I think you're going to see more and more damage happen over this year if the war continues. That sends an awfully strong signal to any other authoritarian regime. Now I can name them, whether it's China, North Korea, Iran, they're going to be the most obvious protagonists coming forward. But obviously for us in this region, it's China and North Korea that we are most concerned about. So the fact that we can bring together a coalition of the willing, if you like, but of a coalition that can support a nation that before last year, not many people had heard about. They hadn't heard of cities like Kharkiv and Kherson, Kramatorsk. These are cities now that are, I bet everyone in this room knows. I've managed to visit a couple of them, so it's quite amazing that the damage that's actually been done in this war. It's just crazy. So that brings me back to Australia and our role. Given that we face such a strong threat here in the Indo-Pacific, given that we have so much to lose, it's really important that Australia continues to do as much as it can for Ukraine. You know, if you, I've read every strategic white paper, a defence white paper from most of the nations and regions, you know, over the last 10 years as part of my studies. And it's really important that we now know that this has to be integrated deterrence and integrated defence. In Senate estimates last week, or week before now, sorry, I established when I was questioning the Secretary for Defence that we've not sent all the Bushmasters that we promised. My guess is we've sent about half of them. Now, we can't say as a nation, stand that we're doing the most we can and best we can when we haven't even sent what we promised, let alone doing anything more. I thought the 33 million last Friday, while welcome, it was really a drop in the ocean. The government has said that we've provided $475 million of military aid. I don't think we have. I think we need to do better because it's important for us as a nation in this region. Thank you, Richard.
An important message. You talked about authoritarianism, and it was noticeable that early in the war, it was the United States in particular framing this war as a battle between authoritarianism and liberal democracy, a war of ideologies, so to speak. But more recently, the White House and State Department have noticeably rode back from that position, and now just talking about this as being more an old-fashioned war for territorial conquest and power, largely apparently because the concepts of liberal democracy don't resonate with much of the developing world. And I was just wondering what your view is. You know, is this war at root an ideological struggle? And should we be proud to be standard bearers of liberal democracy, or should we be more pragmatic?
Well, I'm a very proud defender of liberal democracies and always will be. I think they've walked back some of that language, not because it doesn't resonate, but because it's not about whether Russia is socialist or China's socialist or that, because that tends to put nation against nation, people against people. Yeah, I think the language you're seeing now, whether it's out of the Pentagon or State Department, is about that observance of international law, of territorial integrity, you know, going back to the UN Charter even, and going back to the first principles about, you know, one nation cannot invade another nation. I think that's the language we're seeing now, and one that we should all be continuing to progress, because that's what we're trying to defend against. It's not just liberal democracies, because let's look at some of the coalition of those 50. They're not all liberal democracies, but they all are standing up, you know, for international law.
Thank you very much. Really interesting session. So we're going to throw it open to the audience. And I've got somebody standing right in front of me who would like to ask a question. Zara.
Thank you. Zara Kimpton, National Vice President of this organization. It's all very well you're talking about the 50 countries that are supporting Ukraine, but I don't think there's enough been said about all the countries that aren't supporting. The global South is not supporting Ukraine. And at the moment, you know, we've just seen in South Africa this naval operation between China, Russia, and South Africa. We know that most of ASEAN have not, you know, they've abstained or something. So, and as far as sanctions goes, that is not working particularly well. So, right, it's we are we're converted, but a lot of the world is not. And just a very other sub question is Crimea. I have read that because so many of the Ukrainians have left, that if there was a vote, if that's what they said, that they would have a plebiscite, that actually the people left would probably vote to stay with Russia.
You've just sneaked in two questions, sorry. So the first one is for you, David, and Stefan. If you could answer the second one, David first.
I'd happily take that. The fact that there are 50 countries shouldn't, that there are countries that aren't supporting, shouldn't take away from the fact that there is this coalition, because we're showing it's a very powerful coalition. And we're also seeing, we have to give some countries some space to be able to turn around. Countries like India, I think, we're seeing, a slow turnaround of their position. Now, it might not be at the pace we want, but, we have to look at, they've got a long history of defence ties, etc., which you cannot just undo overnight. So I think we need to be patient with some countries. Some, I think, outrightly we should condemn because they're just outwardly backing that. So abstentions I'm less worried about than votes for, if that's the right way to look at it. But I think we need to give some countries some room to be able to come around to a new way of thinking, and we're seeing that.
The UN had a vote last week. 140 countries supported Ukraine. The Ministry for Foreign Affairs in Ukraine, for example, is very aware of the fact that there are some, whether it be parts of Africa or, as you say, ASEAN, who need a little bit of massaging. And Ukraine is now working, and I'll give you an example how it does work. I've been to the UN, for example, speaking to the Ukrainian representative there and saying, give us the list of countries that support Ukraine. Give us the list of countries that don't support Ukraine. And they're always going to be the same. The Russians, the Serbians, they're not going to support Ukraine. But more importantly, give us the ones in the middle, the ones who abstain. And if you look at the vote about Crimea 2 years ago and again last year, the numbers have grown because there's been that massaging of some countries to say, look, you don't have to go out there and shout and scream, but you should make it. You should make your point, and I think that slowly that will happen. If we look at our region, Asia Pacific, one of the things that the Minister of Foreign Affairs, Kulaba, said to us is, do some work. And we just found out, for example, that I think the Minister for Foreign Affairs in Papua New Guinea is Ukrainian, of Ukrainian descent. So we found out. So there's this work that has to be done on a diplomatic, and that's not our role. I mean, we have an ambassador who does that. But in terms of being able to work with community organisations and others, we're certainly aware of that. Your question about Crimea, if you look at, if you listen to the Russian propaganda, you'll also find that most people in eastern Ukraine want to stay where they are. If you look at the reality, they want to get out. So I wouldn't be, the Russian propaganda works very, very well. I think people in Crimea are disillusioned because they were promised and things haven't been delivered. And any discussion about voting, I think you'd see that I think people now starting to understand what this is about, and a bit to your point, who you're dealing with. You're dealing with a tyrant, regardless of where you come from. You're dealing with this tyrant that has no respect, and I think that's going to come back, and that's going to come back and bite him.
Yeah. Just one thread on this question regarding Crimea. Okay, so I'm Russian, but my mother was born in Crimea, and for a long time I wanted to go there. And in 1991, I was upset, as many Russians, that how come Crimea is and ends up with Ukraine. The problem is any aggressive takeover of any land is just completely against all agreements that Russia has signed previously. Budapest memorandum, etc. Russia promised to defend the territorial integrity of Ukraine when Ukraine gave up its nuclear weapons. So I can say that all of the kind of democratic Russian opposition is completely united on this question of Crimea. Alexei Navalny came out, wrote a piece from prison just a week ago, saying that there's no question that Ukraine's sovereignty has to be respected within the borders of 1991. Everybody else is saying that, and a question of a referendum right now would be morally wrong and ethically wrong, because the amount of displacement that has happened in Crimea and other territories is huge. So lots of people who were natively there, they had to flee or were displaced, and they were replaced by other people. It's not ethical and moral to actually hold a referendum anytime soon. Before any referendum is contemplated, that territory Crimea has to be returned to Ukraine for a long period of time. What people of Ukraine and what people of Russia and different territories within Russia decide in the future, it's up to them. But right now we have to basically replace defend the territorial integrity of Ukraine.
Thank you. Rowan Callett, please.
As the war seems to be bogging down, is it morphing into a proxy war between the United States and China? China is clearly the world's leading authoritarian power. Putin is a kind of sidekick to Xi Jinping. We've heard last week, we saw the Chinese program for the war really replicating what Russia wants. And we see the likelihood of Chinese weapons being used by Russia. We obviously, Ukraine is using American weapons. Is this what we're going to see? We're going to see a proxy war as it bogs down between the two, the great democratic power and the great authoritarian power.
If I might start with attempting to respond to that, simply because the main China regards its principal threat as being the United States of America, doesn't mean, I think, that this is going to be a proxy war. Of course, China does not want to see a strengthened United States of America out of this war. It doesn't want to see a humbled Russia out of this war. And therefore, you know, it's going to take an awful lot for China to walk away from Russia. But I don't think that necessarily means that the kind of future you're envisaging is going to come to pass. Not really, you know, but it's the future. Who knows? David, do you want to have a go at answer?
So, no, it's not a proxy war. Russia has attacked. Russia has attacked its neighbor. You know, this whole thing that, and I think I'm quoting Biden. You know, Russia's starting out to Finlandize NATO, but it NATO'd Finland. Is a really good way of looking at it. It's it might look like a proxy war, but having studied a lot of them, I don't think it's that. And I think you'll see China stay on the sidelines. I doubt very much that they'll send weapons, because that coalition that I spoke of will very, very quickly pivot towards China, and then you'll see maybe an acceleration of the turnaround of countries like India, etc. So I think China will stay on the sidelines. And I was thinking about this over the weekend. That peace plan that China put forward, it could even be seen as maybe giving Putin a way out. Now, no one else has written about this, but I hope to find some time this week to do an op-ed that this just might be the first signal that Putin wants out of this war, is looking for a way to save face, and Xi's might be giving it to him.
Can I just quickly one comment in terms about Ukraine? The difference between now and previously, when there was conflict, that Ukraine has taken a very strong position that says there will be no conversation about Ukraine without Ukraine. For too long, you had Macron, you had Merkel, you had Biden, you had everybody else looking at, we're going to find the solution. Ukraine has been very, very strong and resilient, and I applaud the government for doing that, because we've been saying that for a long time. For too long, others have been, we've been the tool, let's have a fight, well, let's do this, let's do that economically. Ukraine has basically said, we will discuss our own and we will decide our own destiny. You saw Zelensky first couple of days, give us bullets, don't give me airline tickets. Because there were countries that were basically saying, here, come to us and you can run the country in exile. There wouldn't be a country in exile. So Ukraine has taken, and I know that we're reliant on others, but I think the decision on what will happen, if you go back 2 years ago, on the issue of Eastern Ukraine, maybe there was conversation in Ukraine saying, oh, well, maybe we just give away this and we give it. The population was very, very resilient and said, we're not giving up. We haven't been fighting since 2014, having lost all these soldiers, for you now to give something away. So it's a strong message to Zelensky, and to his credit, he and his team have stood very, very steadfast. No, don't talk on our behalf. Okay.
This weekend, he was talking to Lukashenko, not to Zelensky.
Well, I said the other day, I did this thing on Sky. I said, well, why aren't you talking to Zelensky?
Okay. Arthur, please.
Thank you. Two questions. The first question might be more to do with military strategy about Transnistria. I understand that there's over 1,000 Russian peacekeeping troops in that country. What implications does that have for the southwest of Ukraine? The second question is, last week, UK Sky News reported that the majority of Ukrainian refugees are going to Russia. Why? Thank you.
I have got figures to hand, but as I understand it, something like 1.6 million refugees have gone to Russia. Something like 5.4 million have gone to Western Europe, largely Poland and Germany, of course. So was it why?
Yeah, so UK Sky News reported that the majority going to Russia, and that was quite surprising. So I wanted to
Okay. So who would like to answer the question about Moldova and Transnistria?
I can have a crack at it. We've seen, that the troops that Russia first sent in and have been sending in since, just weren't prepared for that war. It's highly unlikely that you're going to be able to break out of Moldova and get through southwest Ukraine with the forces that are there. And after what we saw happen in Kherson, that part of Ukraine is pretty well defended. I'd be more worried, and I'm not, about the troops that are amassing in Belarus than those down in Moldova.
And the initial war plans clearly showed red arrows going all the way into Moldova, but that has long since been shown a work of fantasy.
Yes.
Any other?
A comment about China. Okay. If I can go back to that question, I think right now there is a much greater risk of this conflict being frozen within the current borders of engagement than China actively starting supporting the war. I think what Putin is trying to do right now, and it's a really significant threat that the West needs to be aware of, is just consolidating the territory that his troops have occupied already, and basically convincing the West that, okay, this is what you need to accept for the peace to start. And we heard that Macron was already kind of made a speech in which he was indicating that, yeah, it looks like Putin's there forever. There's Russian people are supporting him. So if not Putin, somebody else similar to him will be there. This is a huge risk. I think it's incredibly important to help Ukraine to liberate its territory as quickly as possible. The longer this conflict goes, the greater the risk that the population in Western countries will get tired of it. They will want just peace. They don't want to hear about this. So I think it's really important to help as much as possible, as quickly as possible.
Thank you, Peter. And actually, what you're just done is advertised very well our next seminar, which will be on the state of the Russian opposition, which is on the 21st, and on the 28th. We've just got confirmation that we will be running a further seminar, a conversation with Leonid Volkov, who is Alexei Navalny's chief of staff. We managed to get him he's flying him here to Australia, and we'll run a seminar in here with him, and he'll be able to talk with all of us about what is actually happening in Russia with the Liberal opposition. So it just leaves me to thank our three exceptional panelists. I've really enjoyed this. I hope all of you have as well. So thank you so much.